Good morning. It is a joy to be with you, and thank you for coming out in such horrendous weather, but nonetheless, it's a joy to be with you. And I'm overjoyed to be welcoming a dear friend and mentor of mine, Tom Tewell, whom some of you who are part of this session got to meet yesterday. And Tom is just a quick bio, as well as how let me take this back, how God puts Tom into my life. Or maybe the better way to say it is how God put me into Tom's life, right? Maybe that's the better way to say it. Right, Tom?
Yes.
He's not listening. Tom has been a pastor for many, many years, pastored in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in Houston, Texas, in New York City. And then his next sort of career was to realize that he had a gift for teaching, preaching. But more so, he had a gift for loving pastors into who God was calling them to be. And so a few years ago, 9 years ago, I think he started, and he's going to tell the story of the Zik preaching program. And in 2020, November of 2020, he called me, and I ignored his call because he has an Atlanta area code, and I thought he was a spam. But nonetheless, he left a great message, and I called him back, and those are at the session meeting yesterday remember this story. I called him back, and he said he was busy, he was getting his oil changed, but he'd call me back in an hour. And let me tell you, I knew who Tom Tewell was, but I never thought I would meet him. I never thought that he would call my phone. And so I was giddy, but I was nervous, and I was pacing. And this is during the height of the pandemic, right? So you couldn't be outside, really. And so I was walking around, and Lydia said, "Why are you pacing so much?" And I said, "Well, Tom Tewell is going to call me back." And she said, "That is great. Can you go pace somewhere else?" And he called me back, and he said, "I would love for you to join the Zik Preaching Scholar Program. And let me tell you a little bit about it." And I don't remember much of what he said after, "I want you to join the Zik Preaching Scholar Program." And then he said, "I want you to get ready in April." It was 2021, so we're sort of emerging from the pandemic. In April of 2021, I want you to fly to Atlanta with a group of people, and we're going to meet for a retreat, because the reality of this preaching program is it's not just you go preach, we evaluate you, we give you some tips, you go preach. We got to create a community and create a culture. And so he did, and the first day that we met, he just told his story of rising to the heights, but also falling flat on his face. And I thought, this is a person that I want to be around because he's authentic, and he's a man of faith, even though he's human too, which was beautiful. And then in November of last year, I said, "Tom, would you ever be interested in coming to the crossroads of Western civilization? Because you are going to go all over the world, and you're now going to be that person. They're going to say, I was in Tarboro," and people are going to say, "I know this person in Tarboro." And he said he would love to. And so we planned this retreat that we did yesterday with the session. And then I said, "Would you talk about the Zik Preaching Scholar Program, because you know it best? And would you also talk about preaching from the beginning of your career to where we are now, as what preaching looks like?" Because he and I share a love of preaching, and we also share a love and a desire to see that the church, with good preaching, God will live on in and through us. And out of that, I know that I have faith that the faith will survive. So I'm thrilled to welcome you this morning, and I haven't told too many lies about you, I don't think. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be here in Tarboro. It is the crossroads of Western civilization, and I love that. I love your history, and I love the church. And, this church has shaped a lot of pastors' lives. You have really helped to shape great pastors. You've had a lot of great pastors. And, of course, Spirit of Living God, Iverson wrote this. So many great things have happened here. But before I get into preaching and talk a little bit about that, today is Super Bowl Sunday. You know that. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the home of the 6-time Super Bowl champion Pittsburgh Steelers. Are there any Steeler fans here? Not a one. All right. But I do have to tell you that years ago, the Steelers played the Los Angeles Rams in the Super Bowl. And everybody knew that on Sunday, particularly when the Steelers were playing and they were winning in the Super Bowl, I would mention Pittsburgh in the Super Bowl and the whole bit. So I got up in the pulpit that Sunday, and people were poised for me to say something about the Steelers. I said, today, even though the Steelers are playing the Rams in the Super Bowl, I'm not going to mention the Steelers. I'm not going to mention the Super Bowl. I'm not even going to mention football. And they wondered, what in the world is this? So I said, but today I do want to read from the book of Leviticus about the ram offering. And I opened to Leviticus where it said, thou shalt take the rams and thou shalt completely slaughter them. Thou shalt cut them up into little pieces and let the blood drip on the altar. And then I closed the Bible and said, friends, blessed be the word of the Lord. Anyway, but I thank you for coming on Super Bowl Sunday and indulging me with a Pittsburgh Steelers story. Before I tell you a little bit about the Zick preaching program, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Would you tell me, what do you think makes a good sermon? If you were to say, you've heard a lot of sermons, but what makes a sermon good or great where you talk about it after you leave church? Anybody have one quality? What makes a good sermon, would you say? Any ideas?
Making it personal.
Making it personal. What do you mean by that, Rusty?
Using your life experiences to relate to the Word.
You use your life experiences to relate to the Word. What else makes a good sermon? Presentation. What do you mean by that?
Just the way that it's presented, enthusiastic, not just monotone.
Okay, so the way it's delivered, the presentation, is a key. What else makes a great sermon, or a good sermon?
What I remember after the sermon.
What I remember after the sermon. That's a great point, Lee. Excellent point. So if you remember it, that's a good sermon later. Anything else make a good sermon, you think?
Biblical foundation.
A biblical foundation. So what's the difference, Beth, between what's the... She's going to ask me a question. What's the difference between a sermon and a talk at Kiwanis or Rotary?
Emotional connection.
Emotional connection, yeah. And also, Beth mentioned biblical basis. In other words, I think a sermon, what's different from a sermon than a talk at Rotary or Kiwanis or the school PTA, is that there's a biblical, Christ-centered message. It's really based on a biblical text that you're going to try to relate the Bible to everyday life experience. Anything else make a good sermon you think of? Other than the biblical ideas? These are all great ideas.
Short.
Say it again. It's short. I didn't quite hear that. It's short. That's what my son says. I love that. That's a great point. Keep it crisp. So in the Zick Preaching Scholar Program, we founded this program about 9 years ago. My calling has been an ordained pastor. I love pastoring a church. But some years ago, I felt my calling was actually to pastor pastors, to be a minister to the ministers. And the question I was asking is, who pastors the pastor? And as Lydia knows, it's more than just the spouse can do, pastor the pastor. So I started a program called the Mary and John Zick Preaching Scholarship to help good preachers become better. And what we started to do was to try to build a supportive community and a learning community for preachers, a supportive community where they could learn some things, and a supportive community where they could look at their own preaching and get honest, open feedback. So as I get into that, I just want to tell you who Mary and John Zick are. Mary Zick and her husband John was a partner with Price Waterhouse Corporation. And at Price Waterhouse, he had a big job in Chicago. They lived in Winnetka, Illinois. They toured churches. They wanted to join the church. No church really met their expectations. There was no church that really fulfilled their needs spiritually. So they decided they would start their own church. And Mary Zick and John's helped to start a church in Winnetka. And Mary was named chair of the nominating committee to find a pastor. And she looked all over America and found a pastor actually who was studying in Scotland, and his name was Lloyd John Ogilvie. Do you know that name? Lloyd Ogilvie is an author of about 50 or 60 books. He was pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Hollywood, California. He was chaplain of the United States Senate. He's had a distinguished career. In fact, Time magazine named him as one of the 10 best preachers in the United States some years ago. But Mary and John called him to Winnetka when he was 26 years old. He didn't know anything about anything, and he was called to be a preacher in their church, and they actually watched him grow. This is where I think of Howard Memorial. You have actually, in your years here, help preachers to grow. You've helped preachers get better, and you've called out the gifts in preachers. And that's what Mary and John Zick did at Winnetka, Illinois, to Lloyd Ogilvie. They helped him to get better and better and better. And he went on to a distinguished career as an author, chaplain of the Senate, met with presidents and kings and princesses of countries, but had a great Christ-centered biblical ministry and was one of the great preachers. And I was fortunate that Lloyd Ogilvie was a mentor of mine. Well, when John and Mary Zick moved to New York City, to Greenwich, Connecticut, outside the city, Lloyd Ogilvie recommended to them that they would go to Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, where I was the pastor. And they did. They came to the church and they joined. So I became Mary and John's pastor. And it was a little intimidating to have somebody who had called Lloyd Ogilvie to come and be in my congregation. And John Zick was a tall man with long arms, and Mary Zick was a beautiful woman, and they were just lovely people, the kind of people you'd want in every church you were in. But when they became dear friends of my wife Suzanne's and mine, well, when Mary died, John said, I want to fly you out to do the funeral, and which I did. And he said, I want to give you a nice honorarium for doing the funeral. I said, John, we're good friends. I don't want an honorarium. He said, no, I want to write you a check. I said, no, I don't want a check. I don't want any money for this. I just want to do it because I love Mary, I love you, and I'm just going to do it for that. If you'll pay my plane fare, that's all I want. I don't want any money. He said, we got to give you something. And so I thought, well, what could I ask John to do? I said, John, here's the thing. Mary Zick loved good preaching. What if instead of giving me an honorarium, what if you'd put whatever money you would have given to me aside and say, what if we start to invest in some young preachers? Help young preachers get better. He said, Mary would have loved that. I said, well, I think Mary does love it. She's alive in the kingdom of heaven. I said, just the way she invested in Lloyd Ogilvie, what if we invest in young preachers today? He said, Tom, it's a great idea. I said, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and everybody can get better as a preacher. And what if we'd invest in that? But I didn't have any idea what we were going to do. I just had this little bit of money that John set aside. I wasn't sure what it was. Well, then John died. And then his daughter, Kathy Manning, said, well, now what are we going to do now? I said, well, what if we expand the program and start really working with young ministers? And what we decided that ministers needed was some support and trust and a place where they could get honest feedback. Because where do you go after you've given a sermon? People at the door come out the door and they'll often say, nice sermon, Reverend, or I appreciated that, or good job, or hey, what about those Pittsburgh Steelers, or something, if they didn't like the sermon. What about those Steelers, you know? So, but you get all these comments, but you never get anybody who would sit with you and go over the sermon and say, have you ever thought of doing it this way? Or have you ever thought, like we were working with one woman in our program, and she gave a sermon, but it was just okay, you know. It didn't start well. And so, you know, if you don't start well, it's trouble. So you don't start well. So it was 9 minutes into the sermon when everybody started paying attention. But for the first 9 minutes, she had lost people. And then it's hard to get them back once you lose them. So we said to her, what if you would, instead of starting the way you did, have you ever thought of starting with the story you told 9 minutes into the sermon? She said, never thought of that. So by rearranging the message, you see what I mean? Rearranging this content, putting the 9 minute mark, putting that first, now she had their attention. And you got to get their attention within the first 30 to 60 seconds or you will lose people. That's a law of communication. So we talk about that in our Zick program, how to get their attention right from the beginning. Another thing we talk about is how to end a sermon. Have you ever been watching a sermon? It's like you're on an airplane, and they're kind of getting ready to land. We know we're going to land. Put your tray tables up and put your full right and lock position. And then you're landing, and you're cruising the airport. You're cruising around, and then you're saying, when is the guy going to land the plane? You know, when's the plane going to land? And you're going round and round, and finally it lands. You know, well, we talk about 13 ways to end a sermon. Ben, we're going to do this actually at the meeting in April. 13 ways to end a sermon. There's different ways to end it, but you've got to end it well and begin it well. Well, then how do you make transitions between your main points and your illustrations? How do you keep the thing going? So we talk about all this. And then the other thing we do is to say to preachers, make preaching a priority. How do you do that? Well, we ask them to plan your sermons not 1 week ahead or a month ahead or 2 months ahead, but 1 year ahead of time. So to think through a year ahead, because you think of what you know. You know Easter's coming, you know Lent's coming, you know Thanksgiving is coming, and Advent and Christmas, you know presidential elections are coming, you know there's all kinds of things in our world today. You know there's going to be deaths and births and so forth. And you know all this, you know a year ahead of time, a lot of things that are going to happen in the world. So why not plan your sermons ahead of time? I learned from Lloyd Ogilvie to plan my sermons a year or two in advance. And it revolutionized my thinking. I wanted to do a series on the 10 Commandments, but there were never 10 Sundays between the beginning of the year and Lent when I could do it. But I looked like 3 years ahead and I said, there's 10 Sundays when I can do the 10 Commandments. So I outlined it. And then what's funny is when you have a sermon idea a year ahead, 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, then if you see a great illustration on thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not bear false witness against you, I'll put that in my file for 2 or 3 years ahead of time. And then you've got it, and then it like simmers. You ever cooked a meal and you put the food on the burner, the back burner, and you just put it on a low heat, and let that thing simmer. And then you hear another, that's an even better story on thou shalt not kill than the one I was going to tell. So that's even better. So your sermon's getting better and better and better and better. So we always say to the preachers, plan your sermons a year ahead, and also edit, so you can keep it what? Keep it short. You want to keep it short. So yesterday, I've been working on the sermon for today for a long time, narrowing. Yesterday, I went out and took a walk, and I thought, okay, I can cut. So I cut it down even more yesterday, and even late last night, before I got into bed, I cut it a little more. And then this morning, I got up early in the morning, an hour before I wanted to get up, and God woke me up. I felt God did wake me up and said, Tom, a little shorter. You have to. You're like a movie producer. You're cutting material and putting it on the edit room floor. Does this make any sense? So if you're getting rid of great material, you're going to have a great message. If you're getting rid of good material, you're going to have a good message. If you're getting rid of poor material, you're probably going to have a poor message. But you edit down, keep it going, edit it, keep working. And one of the great challenges of a preacher are the things I put up here on the board. I just want us to see what the challenge of a preacher is. Like today I'm preaching on Ephesians chapter 4. So here's my dilemma for today. A preacher has got to deal with the text. And what is the text? The biblical text that's been assigned for the day, or the lectionary has, or the biblical text that I chose. But it's not only preaching that text, and the idea is we use a word in preaching called exegesis. So exegesis is to take out of the text what the text is really saying. It's contrasted with eisegesis, where you're putting into the text what you want the text to say, but exegesis is to call forth from the text what's the text saying. Well, how do you do that? Well, the one thing you do is you look at the historical context. Okay, who wrote Ephesians? And when was it written? And what was the historical context? So what's the Apostle Paul, we think was perhaps the author of Ephesians, what was he up against in the early church? Well, the early church had issues of, they didn't want to grow up. They were immature. They were eating pablum, and they were gossiping, and they were slandering people. And Paul was worried that he had a group of infants. So he says to them in the text today, grow up. I want you to grow up in every way into Christ, who is the head. I want you to not be content with pablum, but I want you to be eating solid food. So I got to look at all the historical context. What's Paul saying not only in Ephesians, but how do other early church letters like Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, how do those things he taught there relate to this? So I've got the historical context of this passage that I've got to keep looking at. But then I've got to look at the biblical and theological context. What's the biblical, theological, is there a bigger message here than just what Paul's saying to the church at Ephesus? And sometimes the Bible can be interpreted by another passage in the Bible. So Paul says in Galatians 2, it's by grace that we're saved through faith, not by works, lest anyone should boast. But then James says, faith without works is dead. So how do you deal with that? Grace is, you're saved by grace, with, not by faith, lest anyone should boast. But over here, faith without works is dead. You're not saved by works, but you're saved by faith. So which is it? Is it faith or works? Or is it yes? There's a little of both. So I have to go into the larger message of the Bible and say, how do I put all the biblical message together, even when sometimes it seems contradictory? So I've got to look at the historical context, the logical biblical context. And do you remember yesterday, some of you were here yesterday, I was talking about Mary and Martha. And so their story, and when did they live? And they were friends of Jesus. They were sisters of Lazarus. And they lived in a town called Bethany. And we started to look at their story. And so we were looking at all the biblical background on Mary and Martha and Jesus and Lazarus. And so we got to look at the biblical and theological context of what's the bigger picture that the Bible has to say. Then we've got to look as a preacher at the cultural context today. For example, if I'm preaching on idols, don't have an idol, you don't worship idols. Are there any idols we worship today? So I've got to think about what's the cultural context today. None of you have ever heard of idols today, but we might have an idol today like power or sex or money or pornography or all the things people kind of worship today. So what's the cultural context today about idols? And then sometimes things happen like I was pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church on September 11th, 2001. And all of a sudden, the whole world collapsed when those towers collapsed. And I was pastor of Fifth Avenue Church about 30 blocks north of where the World Trade Center was. And I'm telling you, it was the greatest privilege of my life. And I've never worked so hard in my life, but it was also, I was so over my head trying to preach and minister to these people in New York City after September 11th, 2001. So I had to draw on God. And it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And after the towers collapsed, I learned that people need the grace of God. So I would go up to one of the hotels near us, and I would go up every afternoon at 4 o'clock, and there would be people there who weren't sure if their loved ones were dead or alive. So we would meet with them, and there was big shirts on the walls, and it would say, missing. My wife's name is Suzanne. Missing Suzanne Tewell. And her picture. If you've seen her, call Tom Tewell and my cell phone number. Everybody wore a shirt with that, but on the walls were all the missing people. And I was assigned to the Cantor Fitzgerald Corporation, who lost 6,000 people, had 600 rather, who were missing in the World Trade Center collapse. It was terrible. But trying to minister to them and be with them and figure out the gospel. At the end of every worship service, at the end of every day up there, we ministered with them in the afternoon. We had a little worship service. Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams, Christian pastors. And I learned something about the Christian faith. Every time I was up there, the Muslims and the Jewish rabbis always said to me, would you close the service? I said, why do you want me to close? They said, well, because your faith is a faith of hope. Our faith is a faith of ethics or morals, but your faith is the only one who's really a faith of hope. So I learned that Christianity had something to offer that was hopeful. So in the cultural context of 9/11, what word of hope did I have to offer people? And I learned that people come to church and they're asking the question, is there any word from the Lord? So I had to deal with the historical context, the biblical theological context, and the cultural context of what's happening in the world today. And it was some terrible, terrible tragedies. But also out of 9/11 came some amazing stories of faith. I went outside after the Trade Center had collapsed, and we opened our doors and said prayer service 12 o'clock. And then we did another one at 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock. So when we opened, there was prayer service 2 o'clock or 12 o'clock. And a man came up to me, and we put on our stoles and our robes as if it was Easter Sunday. This man had blood on his shirt. I said, sir, have you been cut? And he could hardly speak. He said, no, I'm not bleeding. I said, are you okay? He said, no, I'm not okay. I got out of the cab this morning. I was late to work, so I took a cab. I always take the subway, but I took a cab this day. I paid the cab driver, and then he could hardly choke these words out. He said, as I was paying the cab driver my cash, I saw a plane hit into my building. I paid the cab driver, closed the door. He said, instinctively, I ran over to the building to see if I could help in any way. So I didn't realize what had happened. I couldn't even process it. But he said, as that plane hit the building and I saw the inferno, the flames started to go, people would climb out on the windowsills. And then he said, he could hardly say these words, they jumped. And then he said, he looked at it, he said, I guess this is their blood. Can you imagine? So he was walking down Fifth Avenue, and so he came over and he told me the story, and I said, sir, there's a prayer service at 12 o'clock. Would you like to come in? He said, I sure would. He said, I just came up the street. He said, what I was really doing is I was looking for a beer and a burger. And he said, I needed some comfort food. But yes, maybe a worship service is what I really need. So I took him in, I put him in the transept to the church, and I started the service. And when I started the service, what do you say after the towers? What in the world do you say? So the first thing I thought was to say, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change and the mountains shake in the heart of the sea. And then we went on, we sang, our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast and our eternal home. We sang that. I read Romans 8, some of the great passages, Romans 8, Romans 12. And then the service ended, and we said, if anybody wants to talk to us, we're available for prayer. And this guy, who I had taken in, and the guy had blood on his shirt and so forth. Now, he wasn't a churchgoer. He's a typical New Yorker. He wasn't a churchgoer. He didn't really believe in God. He didn't have any faith background whatsoever. But he comes running up to me as if I had the best news in all the world, and runs up to me and said, that thing you said at the beginning of this service, that thing you said, I wrote it down. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. That is good stuff. Where did you get that? Is that Tennyson by any chance? Is it John Keats? I said, sir, that's from the Holy Bible, Psalm 46. He said, I've never read the Bible. He said, what should I be reading? So I said, well, here, I'm first of all going to give you a Bible. Do you have a Bible? He said, no. I gave him a Bible. He said, what should I be reading? So I gave him some passages. Do you know that 2 days before, on September the 9th, it was a Sunday, September 11th was a Tuesday, I had given our people a Bible bookmark. And I said, here are the 50 great passages that everybody ought to know. You just ought to have these 50 at your fingertips. And there were passages you would have picked. Psalm 23, 1 Corinthians 13, Romans 8, Romans 12. Great passages about the resurrection. I said, but if you want to know where forgiveness is in the Bible, here you go. If you want to know where eternal life is, here's where it is. So I get the big 50 passages. And I gave these bookmarks out on September 9th, 2001. But our director of communication ordered 5,000 bookmarks. We gave away only 2,500 that Sunday in church and to people who wanted to take them. So I said to Bob Brennan, our communications director, what are we going to do with the other 2,500? He said to me on September 9th, I think we're going to need them. I gave this guy the Bible. He said, what should I be reading? I said, would you like one of our Bible bookmarks? So I gave him a Bible bookmark. And he said, these are your 50 passages. Read one of these a day for 50 days. It was tremendous what people got out of them. We gave away 5,000, 5,000 more, 5,000 more. We gave away over the next month 25,000 bookmarks because people are starving for the Word of God. But they want it within the cultural context of their own time. Does this make sense? So what's the historical background, the biblical theological background? What's the cultural context? Also, a preacher's got to deal with the congregational context and the pastoral context. In other words, I was in a church in New York City where the world was collapsing, but how are my own people doing? And we had people in our church who died, who were elders and deacons in our church who died in the World Trade Center. We had family members who were affected. So I walk into that church realizing that this is not just a theoretical thing in the world out there somewhere. These are my own people who are suffering. The longest serving pastor in the history of Fifth Avenue Church, Ken Jones, was an associate. He was there for 34 years. And one Sunday he died. He was 74 years old. He died at his desk, looking through the new members cards. He died. He didn't get up from his chair. He had a heart attack and died. The next morning, the secretaries came in and the custodians to clean his office and see what was going on. And they found him at his desk, slumped over, and they thought he was asleep, but he had a heart attack and died. Well, imagine the shock to our congregation when we had to announce Ken Jones is dead. Ken Jones he was beloved. He was the longest serving pastor, but people loved him. He was like their Uncle Ken. He was just a phenomenal guy. Well, the next Sunday, when I got up in the church, I walked into that sanctuary, and you could have cut the grief with a knife. It was so, people could hardly speak. They were full of grief. And I just said, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. But then I said, I miss Ken Jones. And there was this, Part of preaching is tapping in to the pastoral needs of the congregation. Because people come with grief and depression and discouragement and bewilderment and anxiety, or they're angry at God or angry at life or angry at somebody or something. And if a preacher can tap into that, so when I said, I miss Ken Jones, I'll never forget that sigh of we all miss Ken Jones. I had tapped in, and I was only been there at Fifth Avenue Church a year when this happened with Ken Jones. But that Sunday I became the pastor of the church because they trusted me. They realized I was going through what they were going through. Does that make sense? So if the preacher can share what we're going through, what's going on in our life, man, that's true. But you got to figure the congregational context, and then there's a liturgical context. In other words, what season is it? Is it Lent? Is it Advent? Is it Pentecost? Is it Easter Sunday? What is going on liturgically in the church year? And how does that factor into everything? And then the final thing I think a preacher's got to think about is the preacher's context. In other words, how am I doing? 9/11 happened, and 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock services. We finished at 9. I prayed with people, and I took a subway home to where we lived in New York City on 96th and 5th Avenue. And I got home about 10 o'clock at night. I hadn't seen any news because I was ministering to people the whole day. I hadn't seen the TV. So Suzanne had the TV on, and I saw the planes crash into the towers, and I saw the rubble, and I hadn't seen any of this. And then at 10:30, we had a call between all the rabbis and the imams and the pastors in the city to plan a worship service. And so they said to me, Tom, you're right at the corner of 5th Avenue and 55th Street in between Rockefeller Center and the Plaza Hotel, and it's good to get there. We can get there by subway north and south and east and west. And what if you host a service Thursday night at 6 o'clock? So I said, of course I'll do that. And they said, would you put together the liturgy, and then we will send it out to us, and we'll see if we like it, and we'll get back to you. So this was Tuesday night, and I was to do all this Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. By this time it was 11 o'clock at night, and I hung up the phone, and I just said to Suzanne, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. This is beyond me. And she said, well, you're always telling people that they don't have to be strong on their own. They have to accept God's strength, and that's what we have to do. So Tom, you've got to accept the strength that God is more eager to give you than you are to accept it. And I'd said this many times to other people, but she was giving me back my own line, Tom, accept the strength. Don't be strong, accept the strength. And she just hugged me, and I'll always remember that hug. She just hugged me and said, you can do it. God will do it through you. So the next day we planned the service and sent it around to the clergy, and they got back. They loved it. But by noon or 2 o'clock, I said to my secretary, Amanda, I just don't like this service. It's missing something. And she said, what do you mean? Everybody said there's going to be no sermon Thursday night. Nobody's got time to write a sermon. So let's just have just hymns and scriptures and so forth. And so it was a beautiful service, litany, all that. But I said to Amanda, and by this time it's 4 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. The service is the next night, 6 o'clock. I said, I don't like it. She said, what do you try? I said, well, I think we need a word of hope. Do you know the name James Forbes? I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's an African-American. He's Ben knows him, he's pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. At 5 o'clock on Wednesday night, I called Jim Forbes. I said, Jim, hey, Tom, hey, I got your service. It looks great. I'll be there tomorrow night. Happy to be there. And I said, well, Jim, I got a favor to ask you. Are you sitting down? He said, yeah. I said, Jim, I think the city needs a word of hope. And I'm not laying this on you, but I think you're the preacher of the city tomorrow night. And I believe God wants you to give a word of hope for the city of New York tomorrow night. And if you won't do it, I'll do it. I'll take it. But I don't want to have that service without offering a word of hope. And there was a pause. And it seemed like to me about 10 minutes. And he said, brother, if you think we need a word of hope, then I'm prepared to give it. And thank you for asking me. And thanks to God for trusting me. I don't have any idea what the heck I'm going to preach, but I will do it. And the next night he got up and gave a phenomenal message. And even he, as he preached it, he when everybody stood and applauded at the end, and he raised his arms at the end and he said, this sermon was not about me. This was all Jesus. And that's preaching in a nutshell. It's not about us. It's about Jesus. What's the preacher going through? Well, Jim Forbes was absolutely, he couldn't do it. And I couldn't plan the service. But preaching is about coming to the realization, it's not about me. We're simply conduits through whom God speaks to others. Amen? Make sense? So I just want to close with this thought that years ago, Beverly Sills was a Metropolitan Opera singer. You know the name. Great soloist. And she was giving a Saturday afternoon matinee solo. She was the premier soloist. And a father and mother took their junior high school daughter, who admired and revered Beverly Sills, to go to. She wanted to be an opera singer like Beverly Sills, but they went to the opera to hear Beverly Sills, and she was amazing. Well, after the opera was over, the parents waited in a long line with their daughter so they could get the autograph of Beverly Sills. And they went into the dressing room, and here's Beverly Sills in the dressing room, and she was greeting all these people and talking to them and asking them questions. And she looked them in the eye, asked their name, and she asked this girl's name, and she wrote a note to this girl. Beverly Sills is doing this. And Beverly Sills said, to the girl, how are you taking care of your voice? Are you drinking water? Are you doing exercises? Are you using your stomach muscles and so forth so you don't strain your voice? Are you doing all the things you're supposed to? And Beverly Sills took 5 minutes with this girl. And she had still got a long line. And the father's saying, okay, honey, we got to wrap this up. Because Beverly Sills she has to sing tonight. And Beverly Sills said, what do you mean? The father said, well, right here in the program, Beverly Sills tonight. There's a matinee now at 2 o'clock, but tonight, 8 o'clock, Beverly Sills, featured soloist. You have to sing tonight. You have to do it. And she said, no, I don't have to sing tonight. He said, it's right here in the program. She said, I know what's in the program, but you don't get it. I don't have to sing tonight. I get to sing tonight. Do you have any idea what a privilege it is to have the voice that God gave me, the gift God gave me, and to stand in the center of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City? And people have come from all over the world, and I have the privilege to stand there, and God sings through me. And she said, I have the privilege of being, and they applaud for me, but she said, actually, they should be applauding for God because God gave me this voice and this gift. And do you have any idea what a privilege it is to preach the gospel, to sing to the glory of God? And so what I always say to these Zick preachers, what I say to Ben Kane is, you don't have to preach Easter Sunday. You get to preach Easter Sunday. You don't have to baptize a baby. You get to baptize the baby. You don't have to install and ordain those officers. Next Sunday morning you're going to do this. You don't have to do that. You get to do that. You don't have to preach Christmas Eve. You get to preach Christmas Eve. Preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ is, in my opinion, the greatest privilege that any human being could ever have. Amen? Amen. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, we thank you for the Zick Preaching Scholar Program. For the 28 people who are in it. They've come from all over the country, California, New York. They've come from Stillwater, Minnesota, and Roanoke, Virginia. And they've come from Tarboro, North Carolina, the crossroads of the world. And we are so grateful that Ben's in the program. As we gather in Atlanta this week, oh God, We pray that you will anoint those Zik preachers with the gift of preaching. Set them on fire like you set John Wesley on fire and John Calvin on fire, as you set Karl Barth on fire, as you set Jesus on fire, and the Apostle Paul. And as these preachers preach, may they feel the stir of the Spirit in their bones. And may they simply admit they can't do it, but would you please do it through them, and may they allow you to speak and preach through them. Now, as a sign, O God, that we love you, as a sign we thank God that Ben Kane is our pastor, as a sign that we want to continue to pray for young preachers across America, as a sign that we want the Church of Jesus Christ to continue to be a place where people can hear the gospel of Jesus, and that the church might grow and be blessed beyond our wildest dreams. As a sign, we want to claim the vision you have for the Howard Memorial Presbyterian Church in Tarboro. We dare to corporately pray together the Lord's Prayer that you taught every one of us who would be your follower and your disciple to pray together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I have the privilege of being the facilitator for the Zik Preacher Scholar Program. Can you see why I love what I do? Thank you for having me today.